Welcome to 5-Minute Bible, your daily guide for your daily reading. Today's January the 18th, and we'll be reading Genesis 19 through 21. Now today's reading continues the story of Abraham, but the spotlight shifts to the world around him. Genesis 19 through 21 shows us what happens when God's promise advances alongside of God's judgment. These chapters sit at a critical point in the book of Genesis because the promise is moving forward through Abraham, but the fallen world around him has not stopped being fallen. God is now simultaneously rescuing, judging, and fulfilling his word all at the same time. For instance, Genesis 19 records the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot is rescued, but barely, and the cities are judged for their violence and corruption against God. The chapter ends with tragic consequences that flow from a life shaped by compromise. Now, Genesis 20 then returns to Abraham, who again fails out of fear by misrepresenting Sarah, and yet God intervenes to protect the promised line. Genesis 21 then finally brings long-awaited joy because Isaac is born. Sarah's laughter turns into rejoicing, and God's promise takes visible form. The chapter also records the painful separation of Hagar and Ishmael, showing that even fulfilled promises can sometimes come with a twinge of sorrow. As you read today, ask the following question: how does God remain faithful when the people around his promises are deeply flawed? These chapters force us to hold together two truths that often feel incompatible. Number one, God takes sin seriously, but then also, number two, God remains relentlessly committed to his promises. The central pattern in Genesis 19 through 21 is the coexistence of these two features of judgment and mercy. God judges Sodom decisively, and yet he rescues Lot. Abraham fails tremendously, and yet God preserves Sarah. Isaac is born through the promise, and yet Ishmael is not abandoned. The story refuses to be clean or sentimental. God's faithfulness doesn't eliminate the consequences, and his mercy does not negate the justice. This also intersects in our lives directly because we often want a version of God who only comforts or only condemns. Genesis insists that God is both, and we must reckon with both because God is faithful even when his people stumble, but his faithfulness doesn't mean that the world escapes accountability. And these chapters also point us to Jesus Christ by showing us that salvation requires both rescue and judgment. Lot's deliverance from Sodom is real, but it's incomplete and fragile because Christ provides the greater rescue. One that doesn't merely remove us from the danger, but transforms us from within. Isaac's birth as the child of promise anticipates Christ, the true Son, through whom the blessing is going to come to the nations. And where Abraham repeatedly places his wife at risk in order to save himself, Jesus places himself at risk in order to save his bride. Genesis 19:21 teaches us that God's promise survives even with human failure, because it doesn't rest on our human ability or courage, but on the faithfulness of God, and a faithfulness that's going to find its fullest expression in Jesus. As you read Genesis 19 through 21, I want you to notice how messy faithfulness looks in real time. God's plan moves forward through fear, failure, judgment, and joy all at once. And tomorrow, the story is going to press Abraham even further, asking whether he trusts God's promises more than the gifts that promises brought. And with that, read your Bible carefully today, devotionally and joyfully, and may the Lord use his word to sanctify you completely, and we will continue our journey tomorrow. God bless you.